The Rwanda Genocide: Division, Hate, and Power. The 1994 Rwanda Genocide stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. In just a matter of months, over 800,000 people were killed in the tiny Central African country, most of them members of the Tutsi ethnic group, slaughtered by their fellow Rwandans, the Hutus. What could drive one group of people to commit such horrifying acts of violence against another? To understand the causes of the Rwanda genocide, we must look beyond the surface-level animosity between the Tutsi and Hutu groups and delve into a complex history of colonialism, political manipulation, social divisions, and escalating violence. The seeds of division in Rwanda can be traced back to the colonial era. Prior to European colonization, Rwanda was a unified kingdom with a relatively flexible social structure. The terms Tutsi and Hutu originally referred to roles in society, with Tutsis largely seen as cattle herders and Hutus as farmers. However, during the late 19th century, when Germany and later Belgium took control of Rwanda, the colonial rulers introduced a rigid ethnic classification system. The Belgian colonial authorities, who took control of Rwanda after World War I, chose to rule through the Tutsi minority, seeing them as more European in appearance and culture, despite the fact that they were a small minority in the country. The Belgians issued identity cards that classified every Rwandan as either Hutu, Tutsi, or TWA, which hardened the distinctions between the groups. This policy not only entrenched ethnic identity, but also created an artificial hierarchy, with Tutsis seen as superior and Hutus as inferior. The colonial system privileged the Tutsi in education, access to government positions, and wealth accumulation. The Hutus, by contrast, were relegated to a lower status, fueling resentment and frustration. The Belgians also encouraged the use of ethnic quotas, ensuring that Tutsis were overrepresented in various sectors of society, from the army to schools, further exacerbating tensions between the two groups. Rwanda gained its independence from Belgium in 1962, but the social and political divisions remained deeply entrenched. Hutus, who made up the vast majority of the population, rose to power in the new government, and this led to violent reprisals against the Tutsi minority. The Hutu-led government of President Gregoire Kayibanda, who assumed leadership in 1962, created a political environment where ethnic hatred was institutionalized. Over the next 2 decades, Rwanda's Tutsi population was systematically oppressed, and many were forced to flee to neighboring countries like Uganda, Tanzania, and Burundi. Despite these violent displacements, the Tutsi exiles continued to organize in hopes of one day returning to Rwanda. The political situation remained volatile, with periodic eruptions of violence between the Hutus and Tutsis, but nothing would prepare the country for what was to come in the early 1990s. By the late 1980s, Rwanda's Hutu-led government was facing significant internal pressure. The country was experiencing severe economic decline, and the government's mismanagement, compounded by the effects of the AIDS epidemic and drought, created widespread discontent. Many in the population were struggling to make ends meet, and the government's increasing reliance on authoritarian tactics to maintain control only worsened the situation. At the same time, Tutsi exiles, who had formed the Rwandan Patriotic Front, RPF, in Uganda, were preparing for a return to Rwanda. The RPF was a military organization composed largely of Tutsis who had fled the country after the 1959 Hutu Revolution and had since grown into a formidable fighting force. They were led by Paul Kagame, who would later become Rwanda's president. The RPF's goal was to overthrow the Hutu-dominated government in Rwanda and to allow Tutsis who had been exiled to return home. In 1990, the RPF launched an invasion of Rwanda from Uganda. This invasion marked the beginning of a civil war that would last for several years. Although the RPF made significant territorial gains, the Hutu government managed to hold on to power with the assistance of France, which supported the regime as part of its broader strategy to maintain influence in Africa. The Rwandan government, under President Juvenal Habyarimana, reacted to the RPF offensive by increasing its anti-Tutsi rhetoric. The regime portrayed the RPF as a Tutsi-led insurgency bent on destroying the Hutu population. The government also began to arm and train militias, most notably the Interahamwe, a Hutu extremist group, which would play a crucial role in the eventual genocide. By 1993, a fragile peace agreement had been reached between the Rwandan government and the RPF, known as the Arusha Accords. These accords called for power sharing between the Hutu-led government and the RPF, along with the integration of RPF soldiers into the national army. The peace deal was met with resistance from extremist factions within the government, as they feared losing their grip on power. On April 6, 1994, tragedy struck. President Juvenal Habyarimana's plane was shot down as it was approaching Kigali, the capital. Both Habyarimana and the president of neighboring Burundi, Cyprien Ntaryamira, were killed in the attack. The assassination remains shrouded in mystery, with some theories suggesting that it was carried out by hardline Hutu extremists, while others believe the RPF might have been behind it in a bid to hasten the end of the war. Regardless of who was responsible, the event served as the catalyst for what would soon unfold. The assassination of Habyarimana plunged Rwanda into chaos. Within hours, the Hutu extremists, including military officials and the Interahamwe militia, began a systematic campaign of violence against the Tutsi population. The government-controlled radio stations called for the extermination of the Tutsis, urging Hutus to eliminate the cockroaches. Armed with machetes, clubs, and guns, Hutu militias began to massacre Tutsis and moderate Hutus who opposed the killings. The genocide began almost immediately after the president's death. Over the course of approximately 100 days, between April and July 1994, an estimated 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed in a brutal and calculated campaign of mass murder. The killings were often carried out in a highly personal manner, with families being slaughtered in their homes, neighbors turning on neighbors, and even children being murdered by their classmates and teachers. The international community largely failed to intervene. Despite clear evidence of genocide, the United Nations, which had peacekeepers on the ground in Rwanda, was unable or unwilling to stop the killings. In many cases, peacekeepers were forced to stand by as Tutsis were slaughtered around them. Meanwhile, France continued to support the Hutu regime under the guise of humanitarian aid, providing military assistance to the government, which further fueled the violence. The genocide came to an end when the RPF, led by Paul Kagame, successfully defeated the Hutu-led government and took control of Rwanda in July 1994. The aftermath was devastating. The country was left in ruins, its social fabric torn apart, and its population deeply scarred by the horrors of the genocide. Millions of Hutus, fearing retribution for their involvement in the killings, fled to neighboring countries like Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, creating a massive refugee crisis. The Rwandan genocide left behind a legacy of trauma, but it also catalyzed profound changes in Rwanda. The new RPF-led government worked to rebuild the country, foster reconciliation, and establish justice. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, was set up to prosecute those responsible for the genocide, although it was widely criticized for its slow progress. Despite the horrors of the genocide, Rwanda has made significant strides in healing, with Paul Kagame's government focusing on national unity and development. Today, Rwanda is often hailed as a model of post-conflict recovery, though the scars of the past still remain. The Rwandan genocide was the result of a complex interplay of factors: the legacy of colonialism, ethnic division, political manipulation, economic hardship, and the rise of extremist ideologies. It was not a sudden outburst of violence, but the culmination of decades of tension, exploitation, and hatred. Understanding the causes of the Rwandan genocide is crucial, not only to honor the memory of the victims, but also to ensure that such a tragedy is never repeated. It is a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred, the importance of international intervention, and the need for societies to heal their divisions before they spiral into violence.